Jed's motivation when it comes to this Deebo Samuel extension? Take it away, Rob.
We've looked at this thing from every angle, right, Grant? I mean, we're looking at it from a team angle. We're looking at it from a fan angle. We're looking at it from a Deebo angle. But what about a business angle? What about the man who writes the checks for the San Francisco 49ers? Because that's a fairly relevant angle when you're talking about $60, $70 million of guaranteed money. It's pretty important that you have the sign off of the guy who writes those checks. And so it seemed like a logical place to examine this from a fresh perspective. I wanted to look back in order to look forward, right? I think you look back at the Jimmy G deal. Jed York coming off of that 2017 season, 5 wins in a row for Jimmy Garoppolo, small sample size, but man, did that light the fan base on fire, right? Was there now an energy around the 49ers team that, let's face it, was not there? If we take ourselves back to 2017, those were dark days, Grant. Those were dark, dark days. And I think when you look at it from a purely business perspective, Jed would happily do that all over again. We look at that Jimmy G contract as an albatross around the San Francisco 49ers neck. If you clear out the emotion, if you clear out the football argument and purely look at it from the bottom line for the San Francisco 49ers, because you know Jed York is all about printing that money. And I can't fault him for that. He's all about making that cheddar. For him, paying Jimmy Garoppolo that $130 million absolutely paid dividends because he was able to put butts in seats. But when we look at Deebo Samuel, I think we have to acknowledge that the 49ers are no longer in that same position. Jed York is probably no longer looking at the franchise in need of saving in that respect. He doesn't need Jimmy Garoppolo and his jawline to come in and plaster him all over the stadium, right? The stadium is now full again because the 49ers are a contender. And so it becomes a question, is Jed still looking at this from a purely business perspective to where he's talking about the bottom line, or would he take into account the team aspect of this, the emotional aspect of this? To me, if I'm looking at this, if I'm Jed York, I've got to say to myself, there's a limit. Like, yes, I want to pay Deebo. Yes, he is a favorite within the fan base. Yes, trading him would cause an immense uproar, but there has to be a ceiling as to what I'm willing to pay him because he doesn't have the same level of productivity as some of those elite receivers over a period of time.
Sure. I'm trying to see this from Jed's perspective, and it's always a bleak perspective, and I can't think like Jed because how does a Jed York think? I don't know. But it seems to me that the Niners don't really market Deebo as much as they could. I mean, he's one of the people that's very important, but they market. Who do they market?
George Kittle.
Jimmy Garoppolo.
Yep.
Trent Williams.
Yep.
Kyle Juszczyk.
Yeah.
Kyle Juszczyk's face is everywhere.
Fullback.
They don't give him the ball, but they market the hell out of those guys. George Kittle specifically. Deebo? I mean, from Jed's perspective, he could be like, you know what? Kittle's the face of this team. If we lose Deebo, fans will fall in line. We'll sell it. Kyle Shanahan will just get the next Deebo, and we'll still continue to put George Kittle's face all over the season ticket renewal packages. That's possible. Also, it's possible that from Jed's perspective, who's his number one guy? Parag. If Parag comes up to him and is like, dude, it's a terrible idea to spend $30 million a year on a wide receiver. It's just bad business. You don't do it. Kind of like how I think they were saying you don't spend $20 million a year on a defensive tackle. I don't care how good DeForest Buckner thinks he is. $20 million a year on a defensive tackle, $30 million a year for what? You don't do business like that around here. We just don't. And if you got your number one guy saying, I wouldn't pay him, and you don't feel like you would take a financial hit, you feel like your head coach is on board and he thinks he can replace him, you just might do it. And to me, that's a whole lot of arrogance and egos making the wrong decision right there. But I'm trying to think like Jed.
Right. And if you're thinking like Jed, you have to think, who are my most trusted advisors? And right or wrong, Jed does seem to view it from a business perspective. And it would seem from outward appearances that Parag is one of the most influential voices within that front office, right? He seems to really listen to him as a trusted voice within the organization. And I would imagine, again, there is some speculation, as all of this is, I would imagine that Parag is that voice of reason of like, hey, we're talking about a guy who has not had back-to-back consistent seasons. We're talking about a lot of guaranteed money. We're coming off of some deals that don't look so great when you have too much guaranteed money for a player that is often injured. So do we really want to invest on that level? But I think you have to examine it from, would it be bad for business from either perspective? If, again, I'm putting myself in Jed York's shoes. So would a trade be bad for business? I would argue that you could sell an incredible trade package. You could get the fan base pretty excited if you got a lucrative package in return for Deebo. But I say that in a vacuum. I think you have to take into account where the 49ers franchise is right now with regard to the fan base. And I don't think you can rule out just how much of an issue it is that Jimmy Garoppolo is still on this roster. I think fans are teetering on the edge of insanity. If you go on to 49er Twitter, it is a weird place, right? Fans are frustrated. Fans are irritated with the way this offseason has played out. And sometimes irrationally so, because of this Jimmy Garoppolo albatross that does hang around the 49ers' neck in that regard. So can they withstand another big blow like, oh, well, we're just going to trade Deebo, even if they're able to sell a huge trade package?
One last thing I want to point out from Jed's perspective, which is Parag's perspective. Remember, Trent Williams last year said that Parag told him, no, we're not going to pay more than a certain amount. Kyle Shanahan eventually called Parag and said, get it done. And Parag said, okay, fine, I'll work for you. Let's do it. But Parag said, this is too much money. You know how much money Trent Williams is getting per year? Do you know?
A lot.
No, do you know specifically? It's $23 million a year. It's not that much.
Yeah.
So if Parag would balk at $23 million a year for the best left tackle in football, who's proven it over a decade, all of a sudden he's going to be cool spending $30 million a year for Deebo Samuel at 26 years old. To me, that's not Parag. Kyle again is going to have to come in and say what to do, because I have a feeling I think I know what Parag's going to do. But maybe I'm wrong.
Is that something, Kyle Shanahan has a soft spot in his heart for Deebo, much like he does for Trent Williams. The relationship doesn't go as far back as it does with Trent, quite obviously. But when you hear the stories about Deebo just stopping in, chatting with Kyle in his office, right? Other players aren't doing that. Other players aren't coming in for a friendly coach conversation where they feel like they can walk in the office and be like, yo, Kyle, what's up? Deebo has that type of relationship. Do you see this as another scenario where eventually, I mean, we still got a long road to hoe on this one, but eventually we get to a point where Kyle has to step in and say whether he does or does not want to overpay for Deebo?
I do, but it's complicated because Nick Bosa is also up for a contract as well. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Thomas Norton says, breaking news, Deebo wants more than Hill, $30 million a year. Yeah, we're going to talk about that next. J-Rod says, breaking news, Deebo Samuel doesn't want Jimmy on the team. I don't even want my Jimmy jersey in my closet. You have a Jimmy jersey in your closet? That's what I just learned.
Strike one.